Classes in Wargame Design, based on George Philly's book, Designing Wargames, Introduction, now available from Smashwords.com and on Amazon Kindle. Paperback soon to be available from Third Millennium. And today, analysis of a rules set, Fall of Manchukuo. This set of lectures is a bit unusual in that it is actually done entirely by recording and looking at the rules themselves. There's no human audience directly involved. I'm using various video tricks so we can actually look at the rules as we discuss them. We turn now to the rule set for Fall of Manchukuo. The complete game, meaning the board, the unit counters, the combat results table, other charts and tables, and some pictures of play, can be seen on the BoardGameGeek.com site under Fall of Manchukuo. There are full-page scans of the map and the unit counters there. As the designer, I can assure you, you are welcome to make your own prints of them and to try playing the game. Fall of Manchukuo represents a campaign that most Americans know very little about, even though in terms of forces involved it was arguably the third largest campaign in World War II after the Russian and Allied American invasions of Europe. The game is division scale. It describes how in the last days of World War II, the Soviet Army invaded northern Manchuria, which the Japanese claimed was the independent country of Manchukuo. The existence of Manchukuo, except in terms of its postage stamps, is questioned by some historians. The board game is large enough because it's division scale that it could reasonably be played by 4 players taking left and right halves of the board, as opposed to being taken by 2 players. One side would take the commanders of the Soviet forces, which include their outer Mongolian allies. The other player would take all of the Axis forces, meaning the Japanese, the Manchukuo forces, and certain forces from Inner Mongolia. The statement that the player or pair of players take the role of all commanders is meant to clue in the reader that you're playing, since you've got something like 100 unit counters on the board on each side. You're playing several roles at the same time, so the game is set in third person plural. We first turn in the rules to describing what you should have in order to play the game. Namely, there's a rule book from which I'm reading. There are 2 unit counter sheets which in the original were printed on pink and blue paper. The scans are from white paper, and readers will have to find some solution to insert color. The map sheets reflect the original limiting technology of G close to 35 years ago now. That is, the map sheets show 8.5 by 11 pages that are printed in black and white. That's all you could do at the time. There are combat results tables, there's a time record chart, there's a terrain effects chart, and the combat results table is a 0 to 9 table, so you need a D10, meaning an icosahedron that's been labeled 0 to 9 twice. I actually supply right here BoardGameGeek.com/image/721024. I am supplying the actual location at which you can find the map sheets. So if you're going to play, the first thing to establish, you could also make this the last thing to establish, is what you have to do in order to win. The Soviet player wins if she simultaneously takes control of 4 cities: Peking, Harbin, Mukden, and Yungkao, and holds them for 2 consecutive complete turns. There is an interesting bit here. If the Soviet player takes control of these and it's during turn 19, and the Axis player doesn't take them back, does the Soviet player win or not? And the answer in this game is yes. If you have held the cities to the end of the game, having captured the cities in turn 19, the Russian-Soviet player does win the game. The Soviet player wins also if she can connive to wipe out every unit in the Axis forces. That is a fairly difficult victory condition to attain, but in principle it could be done. There are also victory conditions for the Axis player. The Axis player wins if at the end of any of his turns there are no surviving Soviet, that counts Outer Mongolia, forces anywhere on the map. That's going to be quite seriously difficult for the Axis player to pull off unless the Soviet player throws away her army, because he starts rather badly outnumbered and stays that way. The Axis player also wins immediately if he manages to control both Vladivostok and the 2 Moscow square. Though that victory condition is also extremely difficult to obtain because the Soviet player starts with a considerable depth of defense between his front line and the 2 Moscow square, and has lateral railroads letting him move lots of forces into the way if the Japanese player tries an offensive. The Axis player also manages to win if the Soviet player does not win. That is, the Soviet player must actively seek out and win by satisfying her victory conditions. The Axis player wins if he simply manages to deny the Soviet player a victory. We now reach the game's start rules. The map board is divided by a border that separates Russia and Outer Mongolia from the areas under Japanese control. The Soviet units start the game in Russia or Outer Mongolia. The Japanese and Manchukuo and Inner Mongolian units start in Manchukuo, Korea, or China. There is a border. The border line goes down the middle of squares, and neither player can start units in squares right on the border. You have to start effectively a half square back from the border. However, once the game starts, the whole point of the game is to enter the other character's territory or to defend your own territory, and therefore units can advance immediately across the border. There is a setup order given. That is, first the Axis player, the Japanese player, sets up his units. Then the Soviet player deploys her units after she can see how the Japanese player has set up. The game starts with the Soviet player taking her first turn, following which the Japanese player takes his first turn. In serious match play, it will often be the case that the Soviet player, instead of making a setup and then taking the first move, will simply make the first move, subject to the possibility that the Japanese player will challenge whether parts of the move could actually have been performed. There is a sequence of play. The game is divided into complete turns. In fact, there are 20 of them. Each complete turn is divided into a Soviet turn, a player turn, and then an Axis turn, a player turn. So each complete turn is based on 2 player turns. We now have the issue of who the attacker and defender are, and there is a specific definition here, a term of art. If it's the Soviets' player turn, the Soviet player is the attacker, and the Axis player is the defender. During the Axis player's player turn, the Axis player is the attacker, and the Soviet player is the defender. So the terms attacker and defender are determined by which player's turn it is, not by historical roles. After all, you could say of this game that here we have the Russian attack on Manchuria, the Russians are the attacker. Or here you could say we have the Soviets coming to the aid of their United Nations ally, the Republic of China. In the War of the Resistance, starting 1932 or so, the Japanese invaded China, so the Japanese are the attacker and you only see the Russians here, are the defender. But under the rules as written, attacker and defender are determined during each turn, so the roles attacker and defender switch twice during each complete turn of the game. Now we specify for each player turn some phases. Many wargames have rather complicated phased moves, move, attack. Fall of Manchukuo is actually quite straightforward. There is a movement phase in which the player whose turn it is gets to move his or her units. And then there is a battle phase, and in the battle phase, whatever attacks have been created are resolved using the combat rules. So units move, and then after you're done moving, after the movement phase is over, you fight the battles. Once the battle phase is started, you cannot move units except there are specific rules for movement after combat. Okay, there is a short description of the map. The map was printed in sections that match what period photocopiers could do. The map sections have to be assembled into a big map. The map sections were printed in such a way that they overlap when they're assembled. The reason you overlap, or at least historically you overlapped, is that there were significant physical limitations on printing technology, and if you wanted maps that actually assembled nicely, given that you didn't have the budget for a huge printer that would print vast pieces of paper all at once, the best you could do was to overlap. There were known alternatives, they didn't work as well. So what do we see on the map? We see a hexagonal grid. The hexagonal grid, for historical reasons, each hexagon is called a square. The periphery of the map has partial hexagons. That is, the hexagon heads out towards the edge of the paper, and before you reach the end of the hexagon, you reach the end of the paper. So you have partial squares that are not quite complete and that all 6 sides aren't there. So you need a specific rule on whether the partial squares are or are not playable. The answer is that if a square has 5 of its 6 sides printed, or at least most of the 5 printed, it's playable. On the other hand, if you have a square in which you only see 4 or parts of 4 sides, the square is not playable. There are also partial squares which are partial because the maps on adjoining pages have been printed as though they overlap. Once you finish assembling the map, those partial squares turn into full squares and are treated as full squares. If you don't like the description in terms of number of edges, there are several alternative things that you could have done in producing the game to identify playable and non-playable squares. For example, you could have printed a very small layer P, playable, or U, unplayable, on each square around the edge of the map, and then the players would have known exactly. But that would get a little tedious, especially if you had to look at it for long periods of time. The map shows terrain. The terrain features all sit inside the squares. So you will have one or more types of terrain that may appear in a square, like a railroad line, a city, mountains, hills, swamps, rivers. Squares are named by the terrain they contain. For example, squares that contain rivers are river squares. The same square may be several objects, so you may have a mountain rail square, a square that contains mountain symbols and that also contains railroad symbols. There is a terrain effects chart. It shows you the symbol for each type of terrain, in case you weren't clear, and it shows an indication of what the terrain effects are. Terrain effects on the chart are not part of the rules, they're an aid to the players. The terrain effects are specified within the rules. Now, buried in that slightly peculiar sentence is an important design consideration. Here you are, you're a designer, and you have a game and it has a set of rules, for example, for movement through swamps. And then you have a table which shows what the movement cost of moving through swamps is. However, as you push the game through playtesting, it may well be the case that time and again, oh gee, we are going to change the movement cost of moving into swamps, and so we change the rule. And now we have to be very careful to change any examples, we have to change the tables, and if we are not careful, we make a mistake and miss changing something. That's not good. Now you have a game in which you appear to have two contradictory rules, one in the rules statement and one somewhat different in the terrain effects chart. How do you resolve this? The answer in this case for Fall of Manchukuo is there is a specific rule telling the player that the terrain effects and other costs specified in the rules are binding, and the terrain effects chart and any other chart are not binding. They're aids to the memory of the player. They're supposed to match the rules, but if they don't, the rules triumph. The map has a grid coordinate system. Moving along the hexagons in a straight line in one direction, you have a row of hexagons labeled by an alphabetic letter. At an angle to that, not a 90-degree angle because these are hexagons, you move parallel to a different axis of the hexagons and you have rows labeled by numbers. And so, for example, Peking is square M19, the 2 Moscow square is square NN21, Vladivostok is square II42. Every square has a coordinate label composed of a letter code and a number code. These are essentially the X and Y coordinates, except it's a skew coordinate system in which the two axes are not perpendicular to each other. They're at an angle of, 60 degrees, aren't they? So we have a coordinate system and we have a definition of what the coordinate system is. We now come to the description of the unit counters. In the original game, the Soviet Union units were printed on light blue, United Nations blue paper, and the Axis counters were printed on Rising Sun pink paper. The choice of pink and blue gives you colors that are maximally separated for people with limited color vision. They're very easy to tell apart. Each unit counter shows a number of types of information that we'll discuss in more detail in later parts of the rule. As a practical point, the original counters were printed on light paper and therefore were unplayable in the sense that if you try to move stacks of light slips of paper around, things will blow all over the place. You need to mount the counters on cardboard. Cutting the counters out and attaching them to pennies has been known to work. You have to do something so they're heavy enough they stay still. We now come to the detailed description of the unit counters. There is a squarish box on each unit counter that indicates, it's exactly like Stalingrad, the type of the unit and the size. However, there is a small complication in that in this game, the size of the counters matters. If you look at the unit counters, some of them have a pair of X's above the top of the counter. That indicates that the unit is a division. Other unit counters have 3 X's, which indicate either a corps or a corps support unit. A corps support unit would be the corps headquarters, artillery, additional attached battalions and brigades, and other good stuff. There are then within the box, indicators of the type of units. The X, the cross, indicates infantry. An open ellipse, it looks like a tank tread, indicates an armored unit. A single diagonal slash designates cavalry. If you see a filled circle, that's a corps support unit. Corps support units are only in the Russian army. Soviet Corps, other than Corps support units, are Corps size units. The symbols I'm describing are the standard NATO unit symbols for sizes and types of units. However, in Fall of Manchukuo, unlike some other games, the size of the unit actually matters. There are numbers printed on each unit. At the bottom of each unit, there are three large numbers reading from left to right. These are the unit's attack factor, defense factor, and basic turn allowance or movement factor. Those numbers in their use are exactly the same as they are in Stalingrad. There are also unit designators. There are a few extra letters beyond the numbers that you usually see. Namely, there is IM for Inner Mongolian, OM for Outer Mongolian, M for Manchukuoan, and GDS for Guards. The historic unit designators have no effect on the play of the game, but if you are doing classic play by mail, in which you generate a list of all of the units and then write down the squares they're located on, you actually need to identify the units so you can describe your move accurately. Fall of Manchukuo uses a zone of control rule, a rule much like that found in Stalingrad. The zone of control consists of the square that the unit occupies and the 6 adjoining squares. A unit's zone of control is always the 6 adjoining squares, even if those squares are occupied by units of the same side, units of the other side, one sort of terrain or another. Water always comes to mind, lakes or open seas, or the edge of the board. Zone of control is a fundamental term of art. The zone of control is very important to play because it affects which moves are legal and which moves are not legal. Now we come to movement. So each unit is located on a square. The hex edges are not in play, the vertices are not in play, the units are only located in the individual squares. When it is your turn, your player turn, you have a movement phase, and in your movement phase you may move any or all of your units. That's very different than, for example, chess, where you only get to move one unit on a turn. With one exception, units move from square to adjoining square. They can't hop like chess knights. The one exception is a C movement. As a specific rule, if you have a unit on the board, you can't remove it from the board except as it is isolated and starves to death, or except as it engages in a battle and is destroyed. But you actually have to do something concrete to take a unit off the board. You can't just remove it from the board so that on a subsequent or even the same turn you can claim that the unit is a replacement now located very far away. How far can you move a unit? Each unit has a basic turn allowance, a number of movement points. The basic turn allowance tells how far you can move the unit using normal movement up to restrictions imposed by terrain. Now, some of the restrictions are positive. Rail movement and sea movement let you move the units further than you would otherwise have been able to move them. Movement points appear afresh on every turn. At the start of each movement phase, the units whose turn it is get a full stock of movement points, 3 or 6 or whatever. Moving the unit consumes movement points, but if you don't use the movement points, you don't get to save them. Instead, at the start of your next movement phase, a complete turn later, all of your units have an appropriate number of movement points available, the number given by their basic turn allowance. Units can't share or transfer their basic turn allowance. I can't use the movement factors of some of my units and apply them to move some different unit. You're not allowed to do that. Also, you have a restraint. There are moves that consume a certain number of movement points. Each possible move consumes some number of movement points. If the number of movement points is larger than the unit's basic turn allowance, you cannot make that move. If you enter a clear square, a city square, or a clear rail square, you pay 1 movement point from the BTA. There are rivers and towns and coastlines. They don't affect movement. If you enter a hill square that does not contain a railroad, a non-rail hill square, you lose 3 points from the unit's BTA. If you enter a rail hill square from a non-rail square, you pay the 3 points because you are crossing a hex edge that is not crossed by a railroad. If you move from a rail square along the railroad to an adjoining rail square, that is, if you're moving along the railroad, even if you're not using rail movement, if you're using normal movement, you pay 1 movement point, even if one or the other of the rail squares contains hills, mountains, or swamps. If you're marching along the railroad allows the unit to move at 1 point from the BTA per square moved. Notice that there's rail movement which is not covered by this rule. Okay, if you enter a mountain or swamp square which does not contain a railroad, there are special rules on rough terrain. Mountains and swamps are both rough terrain. We have one rule for movement through rough terrain because the rules for movement through mountains and for swamps are the same. Oh yes, lakes and sea squares are impassable. You can't move through them at all. Now we come to the rules that lead us toward combat. If you move a unit into an enemy zone of control, it has to stop there. It can move no farther during the turn. If you're starting in a zone of control of a unit, you cannot move directly to another square in the zone of control of the same unit. Observe that the zone of control includes the square on which the enemy unit is sitting, so if I take a unit and have moved it into an enemy unit zone of control, and on the next turn the enemy unit is still there, I can't move straight on top of the enemy unit or on top and then off the same far side. I can't move directly from one square in the zone of control of an enemy unit to another square in the zone of control of the same enemy unit. I can do a few other things. I can move out of the zone of control of a unit, an enemy unit, onto a square that is not an enemy zone of control at all, move around, and then re-enter the zone of control of the unit whose zone of control I left at the start of the turn. So I can move out and then move in again. I cannot, however, then move straight through the zone of control of units. I can only move in and out. In addition, if I am in the zone of control of one unit at the start of my turn, I can move out of that square directly into the zone of control of a second enemy unit, so long as I am moving out of the zone of control of all of the units in whose zones of control I started. We now come to stacking, the requirement or possibility that one can place more than one unit on a square. The first issue is when the stacking limit, how many units you may put on a square, applies, and the answer is that the stacking limit applies at the end of the movement phase, at the end of the battle phase, and not at other times. And therefore, you can move units through stacks that are already completely filled to the brim. The stacking limit for the Japanese, the axis, is 3 units, except that 7-10 3s may not be stacked with each other. The last rule, the statement the 7-10 3s may not be stacked with each other, was identified during playtesting. The Japanese player has enough of them that if you allow them to stack, under some conditions you can get some slightly peculiar play situations. If you don't allow them to stack, life becomes more interesting for the Japanese player. There is also a stacking limit for the Russian player. The stacking limit for the Russian player is more complicated than seen in Stalingrad. That is, the Russians can stack up to 3 divisions in a square. However, they cannot put more than one corps or corps support unit in a square. So if you have a Russian square and you have more than one unit in it, the units other than the first one have to be divisions. In addition, if you have a corps support unit in a square, you can put into the square up to 3 divisions, so 3 divisions and a core support unit can stack. If you have a Russian core size unit, you may only put 2 divisions in the square. And those 2 or 3 statements between them limit how many attack factors the Soviets may place in a single square. That was actually a major computational issue in designing the game. That is, the game has been designed so that the number of combat factors the Russians can put on 1 square or 2 squares or 3 squares, and thus the strength of the Japanese unit that they can attack successfully at 3-to-1 if the unit is doubled from 1, 2, or 3 squares. That's all been computed out, and it's been computed out in a way that is calculated to create interesting playing problems. Advance to rail movement. The rail movement rule is basically very similar to the Stalingrad rail movement rule. You have railroads which are marked on the board. You have cities which function as rail squares connecting all of the railroads that lead into them. If you start on a railroad or city square, or if you move on to one, you are then allowed to take rail movement. Rail movement does not cost movement points. You can move up to 12 squares along the railway without expending any movement points. However, if you take rail movement, you have to spend the rail points all at once. You can't move 6 squares along a railroad, for example, use several normal movement points to move over to a second railroad, and then chug on using more rail movement on a second railroad. You have to use the rail movement all at once in a unit. Now, some of those statements, for example, that you can't split your rail movement, it's perfectly clear the rule could say you are allowed to or you are not allowed to. The purpose of Rule 2 here is to tell the player which choice the game designer had in mind. We now have 2 specialized limits on rail movement. First of all, you actually have to move from rail square to rail square following the railroads. That is, if you want to move from one rail square to another using rail movement, there has to be a railroad line between the 2 squares. You don't have to have done things this way. The rule could indicate you just move from rail square to rail square. Presumptively, the circumstance is the rail square indicates symbolically that there's a complex of railroads available, and only a few of them have been actually indicated on the map. One can point at the old SPI Korea game in which there was road movement, but road movement was road square to road square, whether or not the road squares happened to be connected by roads. The roads were meant more decoratively to indicate that the area was reasonably roaded. Furthermore, if you are using rail movement, you have to obey the zone of control rules. If you enter an enemy zone of control while using rail movement, you have to stop. We now advance to an additional rule, sea movement. Careful examination of the map will show a series of cities and towns that are marked with little anchors. The anchors indicate that the units are ports. To do sea movement, a unit must start its turn in a port. The unit may then, having started a turn in a port, move to any other port that the player also controls. You can move into a port in an enemy zone of control, in which case you have to stop immediately and attack. But you cannot move a unit using sea movement into a port controlled by the defender. That is, it's the attacker's move. I can only move my units from ports to other ports that I control. I can't do sea landing into ports owned by the other player. A unit that uses sea movement, this is Rule 2, may not also use normal movement by expending movement points, and it may not perform rail movement. You move from one port to another and stop. However, if you land in an enemy zone of control, in a friendly port that's in an enemy zone of control, you're required to join in an attack immediately. And once you have joined in the attack, it may be the case that you have to retreat after combat because you lost the combat. It may be that you attack, for example, you attacked an enemy unit that was in doubling terrain, in which case you're allowed to advance after combat, and you can advance or retreat after combat, you just can't do movement. Note the insert in the comments on the rules, namely that a cautious author, rules author, would have added that if your unit landed in a port and has a retreat order, it has to retreat overland. It can't retreat back to the port from which it started its move. That rule, of course, could have been worded the other way, so it could be the case that you land in a port, attack, and if you are forced to retreat, you can, as one of your choices, be retreated back to the port from which you started your move. Rule 3 deals with the special issue of units that are brought onto the map as replacements. Namely, if you have replacements, they are assumed to have occupied their city of origin at the start of the turn, and therefore replacements can be moved by sea immediately. Now we come from the movement phase to the battle phase. At the end of the movement phase, the start of the battle phase, it may be the case that units of the two sides are in each other's zones of control. If they are, with a small number of exceptions, they are required to fight each other. All movement occurs, and then, after all movement has occurred, combat occurs. Battles are fought. The rule requires that all units in an enemy zone of control must participate in one and only one battle. A given defending unit is only attacked once during a turn. A given attacking unit may only make one attack per turn. However, several attacking units may attack the same defending unit. One or more attacking units may attack several defending units. The attacker decides how the attacks are divided into battles. And this is where a significant part of the fine detail tactics comes in. If you are a good player, you are clever in how you divide your attack into battles in ways so that you get favorable odds in at least some battles, even if there is the cost of having unfavorable odds in others. There are now a series of special case rules that fill in all of the details on this. First of all, if you are an attacker and you have units on a mountain square, they are not required to attack. They can just sit there. But if they want to, they can make attacks. If they do choose to make attacks, though, every unit that they are enemy unit they are adjacent to must be included in at least some attack. Correspondingly, if we have defending units that are next to attacker units that are in mountains, it is up to the attacker whether those defender units are attacked. Unless, of course, the defender units are also adjacent to attacker units that are not in mountains. There is also the possibility, since the Axis has a certain number of fortresses, an Axis unit in a fortress and a Soviet unit next to the fortress are never required to attack each other. This is a special case rule. The zone of control does not cross the edge of a fortress square. However, if you have units in a fortress, or if you have units adjoining the fortress, and there are enemy units on the other side adjoining or in the fortress, you may choose to make an attack. If the units in the fortress attack, they must attack all adjoining units of the other side. If you are attacking a fortress, you have chosen which fortress to attack, and you are not required to attack enemy units in any adjacent fortresses. So you can do reduction of a fortress line one square at a time. This tends to be a bit slow. You do have the restriction that each unit during a battle phase of a player turn participates in only one battle. A unit may attack several enemy units. A unit may be attacked by several enemy units. If you have a stack, you can arrange things so that if we have a defender stack or an attacker stack, some of the units in a stack are in one battle, and some of the units in a stack are in a different battle, so long as every unit that is adjoining enemy units, except for the fortress and mountain rules, is in some battle. If we have a stack of defenders, this is rule E, the attacker has a choice. The attacker can attack the defender stack as one lump. All of the attacker units that are attacking attack all of the defender units. Or alternatively, the attacker may split the attacks into battles and attack one of the units in the stack with some units, and other units in the stack with other units. Core support units face constraints. A core support unit may not make an attack by itself. It may only attack in company of a unit that is not a core support unit, another attacking unit, unless there is no other way to arrange the battle. So if we have an isolated core support unit surrounded by enemy units, the core support unit has no choice, no alternative. It must make the attack. If, however, the core support unit was stacked with some number of friendly units or had friendly units in adjoining squares, the core support unit would be required to have in the battle, subject to all the other rules on fighting battles, some of the other friendly units. There is a restriction on breaking combat into battles, namely, the attacker may not launch an attack at combat odds worse than 1 to 7, for example 1 to 8, unless the attacker has no alternative. If the attacker has no alternative way to do things, the attacking units attacking at odds of worse than 1 to 7 are removed from the map before the rest of the combats are divided into battles. Okay, I quoted combat odds. How do you compute combat odds? Short form answer. You take the total attack factors of all of the attacking units in a battle. You take the total defense factors of all of the defending units in the battle. The two totals are A and D. Either A or D is smaller or they're equal. And we will call M the smaller of the two numbers. If the two numbers are equal, M is both of the two numbers. What you then do is to divide A and D, the attacker strength and the defender strength, by M. If A is the larger of the two, D over M is equal, D and M are equal, so D over M is equal to 1. A is larger, so A over M is rounded down to the nearest integer. If D is larger, A over M is equal to 1, and D over M is some number that is rounded up to the nearest integer. Notice that the rounding is down or up depending on whether you're rounding the attacker or the defender number. And I now give some examples. For example, we have two Soviet 10-9-6s and a 2-3-6, total of 22 factors, attacking an axis 2-3-6. The 2-3-6 is doubled on defense for some reason. For example, it's behind a river. So A is 22, D is 6. D is less than A, so M equals D equals 6. The combat odds are 22/6, which is 3, because it's truncated. This is not a round off that happens to give a 3. 22 over 6 is rounded down, truncated to 3. B is 6 over 6 to 1. On the other hand, if I have 65 attack factors attacking 22 defense factors, let's see, the 65 over 22, the attacker number, would be a 2.9, etc. That rounds down to 2, and 22 to 2 is a 1. In an attack of 21 attack factors against 22 defense factors, A is 21 over 21, which is 1. The defender number, though, is 22 over 21, and because the defender is stronger, 22 over 21 rounds up to the next integer. It rounds up to 2. So a 21 to 22 is a 1 to 2 attack. We now proceed to resolve the attacks. We've split all of the combat into battles. All of the battle odds have been calculated, and the attacker then gets to resolve the battles in whatever order he or she desires. The way you do this is that for each battle, you roll a die, and you go to the combat results table. The combat results table has a series of rows, one for each die roll. It has a series of columns, one for each possible set of attacking odds. You identify the column corresponding to the battle, say the 3 to 1 column. You roll the die and you determine the numerical result, and then you look in the table, and there are a series of entries. D a limb means that all defending units in the battle are removed from the board and placed in the dead pile. Each player has a dead pile. It's an area off board where all of the dead units from each side are stacked. The dead piles are always open to inspection by both players, so you can see what units the enemy has lost. Ditto, if the combat result is an A a limb, all of the attacking units in the battle are removed from the board and placed in the dead pile. We can also have a result in which both sides lose units. This result is an exchange. The weaker side loses all of its units. The weaker is the side with a smaller number of combat factors based on including terrain. The weaker side loses all of its units. The other side must lose units whose combat factors are at least equal to the number of combat factors removed by the other side. For attacking units, you lose units computed from the attack factor. For defending factors, the combat factor is the defense factor. That's why we have an attack factor or a defense factor. But defense factors are sometimes modified by terrain. For example, units defending behind rivers are doubled. If the two sides in the battle have equal strengths, both sides' units are eliminated from the board. And we shall give one example. So we have two Soviet 10-9-6s and a 5-7-4 attacking a 2-3-6 that is doubled for terrain. It's in a city. So this is a 25 to 6, or 4 to 1. If there's an exchange, the weaker side, that's the axis, they only had 6 combat factors in the battle, is eliminated. The 2-3-6 is doubled, so the defender has lost 6 combat factors. The stronger side must lose at least 6 combat factors. Guess what? A 5-7-4 only has 5 combat factors. Losing the 5-7-4 is not enough. Stronger player must lose enough units, points of attack factors, so they've lost as many as the defenders have lost. So, for example, they could lose a 10-9-6. There are also 2 retreat results. There is a D back 2 or an A back 2. In a D back 2, the attacker is retreating the defending units through 2 squares from their initial position. The retreat does not have to be in a straight line, it just has to be through 2 different adjoining squares. Ditto, in an A back 2, the defender retreats the attacking units 2 squares from their initial position. That's just start position, first square, second square. There's no requirement that the retreat be in a straight line. But you have a couple of limits. You cannot be retreated into an enemy zone of control. You cannot be retreated onto an enemy unit. You cannot be retreated onto a sea square. You cannot be retreated onto a lake square. You cannot be retreated into a square if at the end of the retreat you are violating the stacking rules. You can be retreated through a maximally stacked square into a square in which you can legally end the battle phase, but you have to end up on a square where the stacking is legal. If you do not have any legal retreat routes for a unit, that unit is eliminated and removed from the board. However, a unit being retreated is only removed from the board if there is no legal retreat rule move. There may be a very inconvenient retreat, inconvenient for the player choosing how to do the retreat, but if that's where the unit goes, that's where the unit goes. If a battle eliminates every unit in a square, every defending unit in a square, and if the defender was strengthened by terrain, there could be a mountain, there could be a hill, there could be a city, there could be a river, all of these strengthen the defender, and if all of the defending units are removed from a square, any of the units that were attacking and made the attack that cleared the square may advance into the vacated square. A D-back 2 causing the enemy units to retreat counts as removing all units from the square. Notice it may be the case that if we've got a stack of defending units, that 3 or 4 attacks were made on the same square. In that case, only the attack that removed the last enemy defending units from the square counts, and only the units in that attack may move into the square. Now we come to an extra rule. If a battle eliminates all of the attacking units from a square, the defender may move any of her units that were attacked into the squares from which the attacker was originally attacking. This means that the defender has advance after combat as well as the attacker. Important issue. Advances and retreats are not movement. They are not affected by terrain. They are affected by the stacking rule. Units that are making an advance or retreat must end up in a stack that is no larger than the legal limit. However, advances are not blocked by enemy zones of control. Units may advance into a square even if the move into the square would be forbidden by the zone of control rule. You can't advance on top of an enemy unit. If you are advancing into a square because you attacked it and knocked all of the defending units off of it, the units that advance into the square, your units, do not all have to come from the same square. If you were attacking from 4 adjoining squares, your units that moved into the square could come from several of those 4 squares. If you attacked defenders on several squares as part of one battle, you can advance into any or all of the squares held by the defender, and ditto if the attacking units were thrown out of several squares and the squares are now all cleared, the defender may move into all of those squares. We finally reach what terrain does. The first issue is that terrain strengthens the defender under several conditions. The defender may be strengthened by being in a city, alternatively in a town. They may be on a hill, they may be on a mountain, they may be behind a river. The defender unit is strengthened by only one of the available terrain types. So, for example, if you are in a city or on a hill behind a river, the defender gets the benefit only the terrain type that strengthens the unit the most. So defending units are never more than doubled because of terrain. If you have a unit with several defenders and several attackers all in the same battle, which can happen under several conditions, the defense strength of each defending unit has to be calculated separately. For example, some of the defending units may be in clear terrain and fight with their normal defense strength. Others may be in a city and be doubled on defense. Still others, this gets a little complicated, but it can be pulled off, may be on a hill and their defense strength is only increased by 50%. So you have to calculate for each defending unit how terrain affects its combat strength. There are coastlines that separate land from water. If you look at the map, it's clear where there are lakes and where the oceans are. There are squares that contain no coast and are on the water side. You cannot use normal movement to go through there. We are, after all, in midsummer. None of the lakes or bodies of sea have frozen. We have fortresses. If you are sitting in a fortress, you have a number of benefits. First of all, units defending in a fortress or placed in a fortress are never required to attack, even if they are in an enemy zone of control. Correspondingly, enemy units that are next to units of the other side in a fortress are never required to attack them. They just sit there next to each other. If the units in the fortress attack, or if they are attacked, these special effects of fortresses are cancelled. If the Axis chooses to attack a fortress, all Axis units next to the fortress must join in the attack. If the units in a fortress are attacked and a D-back 2 is the combat results, the defender is allowed to sit there and is not required to retreat. Units in a fortress are also doubled as a result of combat. If the Axis player attacks out of a fortress, all units of the other side adjacent to the fortress, except units in other fortress squares, must be attacked. Observe that there are hills. The hills are hash marked. To enter a hill, unless you're moving along a rail line, special rule which we'll discuss, a unit that enters a hill square must spend 3 movement points. Also, if a unit is sitting on a hill square and is the defending unit, its defense strength is increased to 3/2 of its normal value. For example, the defending 236 becomes a defending 4.5. If the other side attacks that 236 successfully because it had the benefit of terrain while on defense, the attacker may advance into the defending square if the square is cleared. We now reach mountain swamps, which we jointly call rough terrain. The rules for movement through mountains and through swamps are the same, so we just lump them together as rough terrain and talk about them once. Except for the effect of railroads, a unit may enter at most 1 rough terrain square per turn. You must start your turn adjacent to the rough terrain square. You then move 1 square into the rough terrain square, and there you must stop. You move no further that turn. Units in mountain squares are exempt from the zone of control rules in the sense that an attacker unit on a mountain square is never required to attack, even if it is an enemy zone of control. The attacker may choose to attack, in which case all adjoining units of the other side must be attacked by someone, but if the attacker chooses to have the unit just sit there, they're allowed to do so. Defending units in mountain squares are doubled. We now reach cities, towns, and ports. Cities are crosshatched. The crosshatch fills most of the square. Towns are large filled dots. Ports are cities or towns with anchor symbols next to them. Towns have no effect on combat. Units defending in cities are doubled. There is a rule to determine which side controls each city. At the start of the game, units in Russia and Outer Mongolia are under Soviet control. All cities and towns, I should say, all other cities and towns are under Axis control. You take control of a city from the other player by moving one of your units into that city or town. And you can do that during the movement phase or as a result of movement after combat. Once you've moved into a city, you control it. To keep control of the city, you do not have to leave units in the square. Both sides had secret police detachments not visible on the map to take care of this. Ownership is determined by whoever most recently moved into the port or city, except for the cities and towns you started out with, which you automatically control at the start of the game. Putting a city or town in an enemy zone of control as opposed to moving into it does not cause the control of the city to change. In order to take control of a city for your side, you actually have to move a unit into it or have owned it from the start of the game. There are river squares. The rules here specify how river squares work. They work exactly the same as rivers in Stalingrad. If all of the attacking units are on river squares and the defender is on an adjoining square that is not a river square of the same river, meaning you're not attacking up or down river, the defending unit is doubled. River end squares function as river squares, except that if the attacking unit is on a river end square and the defending unit is on the square at which the river end square points, the defending unit is not doubled because the river end square does not function at a river square for the square at which it points. Attackers are on a river and the defending units are on a different river, meaning the river does not flow from attacker squares directly to defender squares or vice versa. The defender is doubled. On the other hand, if you have a more complicated situation where the defender is on a river square and some of the attackers are on the same river, an adjoining square of the same river that the defender is on, or are on clear terrain, the defender is not doubled. Sometimes this looks as though it would get a bit complicated, but there is simply a simple rule for clarifying things. This comes up in particular if you have rivers coming together or branching. If a unit would have been doubled if one of the branches of the rivers was not there, the river is not undoubled by adding a river to the board. And that's the simple check if you've got some complicated situation. Imagine the situation if one of the river branches was not there. If the defender is still doubled under that condition, adding the river branch does not undouble the defender. There are replacement rules. During the game, both players may use replacements to bring units back from the dead. Well, units other than cavalry which cannot be replaced. The replacements are calculated in terms of the defense factors of the unit. If we have, for example, one of those Russian 9-10-6s that has been eliminated, the cost to replace that unit is 10 defense factors. The cost to replace that 2-3-6 is 3 defense factors. Both sides are getting defense factors each turn with which to replace units. The defense factors are accumulated until they are used. So if I have, for example, 20 defense factors available for replacements, I can replace 2 of the 9-10-6s using up the 20 factors of replacements. Now I have no accumulated replacement factors. You bring on replacement units in the replacement cities that have been listed. The stacking rules do not limit how many units may be brought on as replacements in one city. However, during the movement phase, if I bring on a huge stack of units in one replacement city, I must move the replacement units in such a way that at the end of the movement phase, my position is legal. The Soviet player gets 8 defense factors per turn of replacements. There are 2 locations that they may be brought on, Vladivostok and the 2 Moscow Square. The Soviet player must keep the 2 Moscow Square free of Japanese zones of control in order to use that square for bringing on replacements. The Axis player has 5 replacement cities: Shanghai, Peking, Sinanju, Harbin, and Mukden. For each replacement city still under Axis control, the Axis player gets 5 replacement defense factors. They may be brought onto the board in any replacement city not occupied by a Soviet Union unit or controlled by the Soviets. Notice this was a change from the original rule in which Seoul, down in the Korean peninsula, was a replacement city. This turned out to work very poorly because the Japanese player could hide all of his army on the Korean peninsula and invite the Russians to try to pry him out in the available number of turns, which was extremely unpleasant. There is a supply rule. A supply line must be traced from each unit to a supply point. The supply line is a line of squares not including the unit and not including the replacement city, or supply point I should call it. Supply lines can't go through sea squares, lake squares, or enemy zones of control. A friendly unit does not negate an enemy zone of control for supply purposes. If a unit is out of supply, it's isolated. If it's out of supply for 4 consecutive complete turns, it's eliminated from the game and dropped into the dead pile. Now, there is a specific rule that determines exactly when you went out of supply. Well, it might be that you were moved into where there was a movement on one side or the other that put the unit out of supply, in which case the unit is out of supply and is removed at the start of the corresponding movement phase 4 turns later. A unit could also be put out of supply by an advance or retreat after combat, in which case the unit is present during the movement phase and is eliminated at the start of the battle phase 4 turns later. Unless, of course, the unit gets a supply line back in the meantime. The Soviets use Vladivostok or 2 Moscow as supply points. The Axis use Shanghai, Peking, Mukden, Sinanju, Harbin, Mukden, Seoul, or any fortress square as a supply point. A square may not be used as a supply point if it's physically occupied by an enemy unit or if it's captured and now belongs to the other side. The square occupied by the supply point and the unit being supplied are not part of the supply line. This means that if you are a unit defending a supply point, you can't be out of supply because you're sitting on the supplies. Amusing issue. Suppose there is combat or something, and as a result of what happens, both sides' units are put out of supply during the same part of the same turn. For example, I move a unit to isolate some units of the other side, and when I move the unit to cut off the supply line, I have cut off the supply of my own unit. If you're clever, you can find ways of doing this. In this case, the units that were stationary, the units whose turn it was not, are eliminated first. The units that moved, which could include attacker or defender advance after combat, are eliminated second. If eliminating units of one side opens up a supply line to the units of the other side, well, they're supplied again. They're not eliminated. And finally, there are rules that refer to a player as being female or male, and those rules apply equally to both sides. Some rules apply only to the German player. It's really the Axis player because it's the Japanese, or only to the Russian player. This should be fairly familiar. And finally, I explain once again what the dead pile is. We have now gone through all of the rules.